They laughed at her. They mocked her. And in front of hundreds of guests, they poured red wine all over her white gown, believing she was nothing. But here's the truth they never saw coming. That woman they humiliated wasn't a maid. She wasn't an outsider sneaking into their glittering world. She was the billionaire CEO, the very person holding a $1.5 billion contract that could rescue their collapsing empire. In less than 5 minutes, their cruel laughter would cost them everything. Their fortune, their legacy, their name. Gone. With one phone call, she would erase generations of privilege, turning their ballroom into the stage of the most expensive mistake in American high society. This is not just a story about money. It's about arrogance. It's about cruelty. And it's about the true price of disrespect. Welcome to Black Voice Matter, where we uncover the stories they'd rather keep hidden. If you believe dignity is priceless, stay with us. Because what happened that night will leave you speechless. The chandeliers at the Chicago Art Institute glowed like captured starlight. They showered the ballroom in a golden haze, bouncing off crystal glasses and sequined gowns. Laughter rippled through the air like champagne bubbles. Smooth jazz curled in the corners of the room, and every guest carried themselves as if they owned the city. It was a night meant for celebration, a night where reputations were polished and handshakes carried the weight of million-dollar promises. And yet, in that same golden light, a woman stood utterly exposed. Dr. Maya Johnson. A black woman in a gown as white as untouched snow, her hair pulled into a sleek bun, a string of pearls resting just below her collarbone. She had walked into the ballroom with quiet confidence, the kind that comes not from wealth, but from survival, from perseverance, from knowing the road you've walked was steeper than anyone else's. But all it took was one voice to shatter the illusion. Oh my God, since when do they let the help dress like this? Vivian Callahan's words sliced through the music like broken glass. Heads turned, eyes narrowed, and in seconds, Maya was no longer a guest. She was entertainment. Laughter spread, cruel and careless. Phones rose into the air to capture every second of her humiliation. And then, the final blow. A glass of red wine spilling across her dress, dripping down like blood onto marble floors. The crowd erupted. To them, it was comedy. To her, it was déjà vu. Because this wasn't the first time Maya Johnson had been made to feel small. She remembered being 12 years old, standing in a classroom in Detroit, while kids pointed at her worn-out shoes and laughed until her face burned. And she remembered what her grandmother told her that day. Baby, you can't control their eyes, but you can control your spine. Don't you ever let them see you bend. So she stood, shoulders back, eyes steady, even as her gown clung to her skin, even as every laugh dug into her like knives. What no one in that room understood was that the woman they had chosen to humiliate already owned more than they could ever imagine. The building they stood in, the companies that employed their husbands, the banks that held their mortgages. All of it, threads in the empire she had built with her own hands. And in her clutch that night was a contract worth $1.5 billion. A contract that could either save the Callahan family or condemn them. The guests thought they were watching an outsider's humiliation, but what they were really witnessing was the prelude to their own downfall. Because the woman in the wine-stained gown was about to teach them the cost of cruelty, to understand why this single moment carried the weight of an empire's destruction. You have to know who Dr. Maya Johnson really was, and why the Callahan dynasty, behind all its glitter and gold, was already crumbling from within. The Chicago Art Institute glowed that night. Columns bathed in gold, chandeliers dripping light across marble floors, polished to a mirror's shine. It was the kind of night where power dressed itself in silk and champagne. Every laugh sounded rehearsed. Every handshake carried the weight of millions, and at the center of it all, the Callahan family. Edward Callahan, tall but tired, playing the role of a man still in control. Vivian, his wife, sharp as glass in her emerald gown. Connor, their son, already swaying with drink. And Isabella, their daughter, her phone raised high, recording herself as if the evening belonged to her. This was their world, a performance of wealth, a performance of superiority, but performances are fragile. One crack, and everything can collapse. That crack appeared when she entered. Dr. Maya Johnson, 46 years old, a black woman in a gown as white as fresh snow, pearls resting gently at her collarbone, her posture calm, her presence commanding. She didn't walk in to impress. She didn't need to, but in that room, power wasn't seen in her grace. It was dismissed by prejudice. Vivian's voice was the first to strike. "Oh my God, when did the help start wearing gowns like this?" The words sliced through the music. Laughter followed, cruel and careless. Heads turned, eyes narrowed, and just like that, Maya was no longer a guest. She was a spectacle. For a moment, she froze under the glow of the chandeliers. They no longer felt like starlight. They felt like interrogation lamps, pinning her in place. Her chest tightened. Her body begged her to leave, but memory held her still. Detroit, 12 years old, standing in a classroom while kids mocked her worn-out shoes, and her grandmother's voice, steady and firm. "Baby, you can't control their eyes, but you can control your spine. Don't you ever let them see you bend." So Maya didn't bend. She stood, silent, unbroken, but cruelty has a way of multiplying. Connor lifted his glass, grinning. "Somebody call housekeeping. We've got a spill waiting to happen." His friends howled. Isabella, sweet smile hiding venom, leaned toward her circle. "Maybe she's looking for the broom closet." More laughter. And then, the moment that would stain the night forever. Isabella approached with a glass of red wine, her voice smooth, dripping false kindness. "You look thirsty. Here, let me help." Maya reached out, hopeful for a fragment of decency. But Isabella shifted her foot. A subtle trip. Maya stumbled. The wine cascaded down her gown, spreading like blood across snow. The crowd erupted. Phones rose higher. Connor nearly doubled over, recording the fall like a comedy skit. Vivian's voice rang out again. "Security, before she breaks something valuable." For the crowd, it was entertainment. For Maya, it was a trial. Humiliation in private cuts deep. Humiliation in public, it carves scars that never fade. Sociologists call it social death, a stripping away of dignity before an audience. History remembers moments like these. Segregated lunch counters, black athletes booed for daring to win, shoppers followed in luxury stores, suspected simply for existing. And here it was again. In 21st century Chicago, wrapped in gowns framed by chandeliers, the cruelty was the same. Maya lay on the marble floor, her dress clinging, her palms stinging from the fall. Laughter echoed above her, loud, endless, each voice adding weight to her humiliation. Inside her, two voices fought. One whispered, "Leave, walk away, this isn't your world." The other, steadier, carried her grandmother's tone. "Stand, baby. Even when they want you crawling, you stand." So she rose. Slowly, deliberately. Her hands shook, but her head was high. Her eyes, cold, unflinching. The laughter softened, just slightly. Some phones lowered. A few guests sensed something had shifted, but most continued, blind to the storm rising in the woman they thought powerless. Because here was the truth no one in that ballroom knew. Dr. Maya Johnson was not an outsider. She was the founder and CEO of Johnson Global Holdings, worth $60 billion, the very building they stood in. One of dozens she owned. The Callahan empire's future, balanced on a contract in her clutch, a contract worth $1.5 billion. In that moment, the crowd thought they were watching her fall, but in truth, it was the Callahans who had already begun to collapse. They just hadn't realized it yet. To understand why this moment mattered so much, you have to know who Maya Johnson really was. The road she walked, the fire that forged her, and why the Callahan empire, behind all its glitter, was already rotting from within. The woman standing in that ballroom, stained, humiliated, yet unbroken, was not born into power. Her story began in Detroit. Not the Detroit of glossy car ads or Motown nostalgia, but the Detroit of cracked sidewalks, shuttered factories, and neighborhoods where opportunity was scarce and hope was rationed. Maya grew up in a 2-bedroom apartment above a corner store. Her parents weren't there. Her father disappeared before she could remember his face. Her mother, overwhelmed by poverty and addiction, drifted out of her life before Maya turned 10. It was her grandmother, Evelyn, who raised her. A woman who worked 2 jobs, cleaning offices by day, cooking in a diner by night. Her hands were calloused, her back bent with years of labor, but her voice carried steel. "Baby," she used to say, "we don't get to choose the road we start on, but we can choose how far we walk." Maya's childhood was marked by struggle. She remembered winters when the heat cut out, when she and her grandmother wrapped themselves in layers of blankets, pretending it was an adventure. She remembered nights when the refrigerator hummed empty, and Evelyn would turn a single can of beans into dinner with laughter, so Maya wouldn't feel the hunger gnawing. School was no refuge. She walked into classrooms with worn shoes, her books hand-me-downs from students years before. Some teachers dismissed her, assuming she'd never amount to much. Some classmates mocked her, laughing at the way she dressed, the way she spoke, the color of her skin. But Maya had fire. Every insult, every slight she stored away, not as wounds, but as fuel. One teacher, Mr. Harrison, noticed. "You've got a mind sharper than a diamond," he told her once. "You don't just solve problems, you see through them. Don't let anyone dim that light." By high school, Maya was devouring every book she could find, economics, biographies, anything that explained how the world worked. She became obsessed with the idea of building, not just surviving. And when the acceptance letter from Harvard arrived, on a full scholarship, Evelyn wept. Not quiet tears, but sobs of release. Because in that moment, the sacrifices of a lifetime finally bore fruit. At Harvard, Maya was out of place. She walked among children of senators, bankers, CEOs, students who flew home on private jets, while she worked part-time at the library to send money back to Detroit. She felt their stares. She heard the whispers. But she also heard her grandmother's voice in her head. "Don't you ever let them see you bend." So she stood tall, even when professors questioned her presence, even when classmates excluded her from study groups. She graduated with honors, her name carved into the records of a place that had once doubted she belonged. After Harvard, Maya could have taken the safe path, a corporate job, a steady salary. But safety wasn't what she was after. She wanted independence. She wanted control. Her first venture was real estate. She scraped together her savings, bought a foreclosed duplex in a neglected Detroit neighborhood, and renovated it with her own hands. She rented it out, used the income to buy another, then another. By 30, she owned a dozen buildings. By 35, she was investing in commercial properties. When Detroit began to rebound, her empire grew with it. But Maya wasn't content with bricks and mortar. She saw the future in technology and healthcare. She invested in startups, many led by women and minorities who had been ignored by mainstream venture capital. Some failed, but the ones that succeeded, medical tech, renewable energy, financial platforms exploded, and so did her net worth. By her mid-40s, Maya Johnson was no longer the girl from Detroit who had nothing. She was the CEO of Johnson Global Holdings, an empire spanning real estate, technology, and healthcare. Her personal fortune exceeded $60 billion. But through it all, she never forgot where she came from. She created scholarships for girls from neighborhoods like hers. She built community centers in Detroit. She sat on panels, telling her story, not to boast, but to prove. If I could rise from nothing, so can you. Her journey mirrored others before her. Oprah Winfrey, born into poverty in Mississippi, who became one of the most powerful women in media. Ursula Burns, raised in a New York housing project, who rose to become the first black woman CEO of a Fortune 500 company. Maya stood among them, a living reminder that resilience, when paired with opportunity, can bend history itself. And yet, for all her wealth, for all her power, Maya still carried scars. Because money can buy influence, it can buy protection, but it cannot erase memory. The memory of hunger, the memory of laughter echoing in classrooms, the memory of being told she didn't belong. Those scars never left her. They lived in her, silent until nights like the gala, when cruelty resurrected them in front of hundreds. That was the true irony of the Callahan gala. They thought they were mocking a stranger. They thought they were humiliating someone beneath them. But what they were really doing was awakening every scar Maya had ever buried. And scars, when awakened, can turn into weapons. To understand why the Callahans' arrogance was so dangerous, we need to look closer at them. Because behind the glitter of their gala, their empire was already rotting. And the woman they mocked was about to light the match. Behind the chandeliers and laughter of that night stood a family built on a crumbling foundation. The Callahans. For generations, their name had carried weight in Chicago. They were old money. Real estate barons who once owned entire blocks of the city. Their crest still hung above marble fireplaces. Their photos lined the walls of country clubs and museums. But if you looked closely, beneath the polish, beneath the performance, the cracks were already spreading. At the head of the family was Edward Callahan, Sr., 62 years old, a man who had inherited power, but never earned it. His father had built Callahan real estate from the ground up, buying cheap land during the post-war boom, stacking skyscrapers that touched the Chicago sky. But Edward was not his father. He spent decades trying to prove he belonged in the same league, and failing. Every handshake deal that went wrong, every risky investment that soured, every whisper of, "He's not the man his father was." They ate at him. Now Callahan real estate was drowning in debt, mortgages overdue, loans hidden in shell accounts. Behind the mask of wealth, bankruptcy loomed. Edward wore expensive suits, smoked imported cigars, played the role of patriarch. But inside, he was a man terrified of being exposed. Beside him stood Vivian Callahan, 59, elegant, merciless. Vivian wasn't interested in balance sheets or profit margins. Her currency was status, country club memberships, charity galas, the whispered envy of other women when she walked into a room. She lived for appearances, for the power of exclusion, deciding who belonged and who didn't. She was the kind of woman who could compliment your dress and, in the same breath, cut you down with a smile. Losing money didn't scare her. Losing status did. And that's why the gala meant everything. It wasn't just a party. It was her throne room, her chance to remind Chicago that the Callahans still ruled. Then there was Connor, 29, the golden boy who turned to rust. Connor had never worked a day in his life. Every failed venture, a craft beer startup, a clothing line, a nightclub, was quietly bailed out by his father's money. He lived on yachts, in penthouses, surrounded by friends who cared more about his credit card than his character. But failure had twisted him. Underneath the tailored suits and Rolex, Connor carried cruelty. Mocking others made him feel powerful, and on the night of the gala, pointing his phone at Maya Johnson, laughing at her humiliation, was just another way to hide his own worthlessness. Finally, Isabella, 26, sharp, beautiful, dangerous. Unlike her brother, Isabella wasn't careless. She was calculated. She had learned from her mother that cruelty could be an art form. Humiliating others was her way of proving superiority, her way of saying, "I am untouchable." She wore her ruthlessness like perfume, subtle to some, intoxicating to others, suffocating to those beneath her. But like perfume, it was temporary. And when the mask faded, there was nothing underneath. Together, the Callahans were a portrait of decline. Old money, fading fast. History has seen this story before. The Vanderbilts, once the richest family in America, reduced to fragments of wealth within a century. The Astors, once untouchable in New York society, eventually outpaced by newcomers who worked harder, dreamed bigger. Old money has one fatal flaw. It assumes the future will look like the past. It forgets that fortunes rot when left in the hands of those who only know how to spend, not create. The Callahans were the living embodiment of that decay. They clung to chandeliers and marble halls while termites chewed at the beams. They laughed at Maya Johnson, blind to the fact that she represented everything they no longer were: ambition, resilience, creation. Inside Edward's chest that night was not pride, but panic. He needed Maya Johnson's signature on that contract. $1.5 billion, enough to pay off debts, enough to keep the family's name gilded for another generation. But as his wife mocked, as his children laughed, Edward stayed silent. And silence, in moments of cruelty, is complicity. Vivian, meanwhile, felt alive. Every cruel remark that drew laughter reinforced her power. She didn't care who Maya Johnson was. She only cared that Maya's humiliation affirmed her status. Connor and Isabella. They weren't just laughing at Maya. They were laughing at the idea that consequences would ever reach them. They had grown up in a world without consequences, but that world was ending, and they didn't even see it. The Callahans, like the Vanderbilts and Astors before them, believed wealth was permanent, that their name would always open doors, but wealth without character is like a mansion built on sand. And on that night, as red wine bled across Maya Johnson's gown, the Callahans were already sinking. To truly understand the storm that followed, we need to return to that ballroom, because humiliation was only the beginning. What came next was retribution. The truth is, Maya's humiliation didn't begin on the ballroom floor. It began at the door. The entrance of the Chicago Art Institute that night was a parade of privilege. Luxury cars pulling up one after another, drivers rushing to open doors, women stepping out in gowns that cost more than a year's rent, men laughing loudly as if the city itself belonged to them. Each guest glided toward the entrance, past velvet ropes, greeted with smiles and nods. A flash of an invitation, a handshake, a welcome, enjoy the gala. No questions asked. And then Maya arrived. Her car, sleek but understated, stopped at the curb. She stepped out, radiant in her white gown, but the valet didn't see elegance. He saw an intruder. "Service entrance is around back," he muttered, barely looking at her. Maya froze. Service entrance. The words stung like a slap. She steadied herself, lifted her chin. "I'm here for the gala," she said softly. The valet blinked, confused. It was as if his mind couldn't process the possibility. Finally, he waved her toward the front, reluctant, dismissive. At the door stood a guard. Tall, broad, clipboard in hand. His name tag read Jake. Maya handed him her invitation, a gold-embossed card, identical to every other guest's. Jake's smile vanished. The warmth he had shown to the couple before her evaporated. He studied the invitation as if it were counterfeit money, turned it over, held it to the light, ran his finger along the edges. "Don't see your name here," he said, his voice loud enough for others in line to hear. Maya inhaled. Calm. "Could you check again?" "I'm expected." Jake dragged his finger down the list a second time, then a third, each motion exaggerated, as if for an audience. Finally, he shook his head. "Nope. No, Johnson." Behind her, another guest arrived, a woman in a fur coat. Jake barely glanced at her invitation before waving her inside with a grin. The woman walked past Maya, her perfume heavy, her glance dismissive. Maya held her ground. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her mind. "Don't you let them move you off your path. If you're meant to be somewhere, you stand until the door opens." So she stood. Jake sighed. "Gonna need some ID." She handed over her driver's license, a legitimate New York ID, recently issued. Jake examined it like a detective with stolen property, held it to the light, ran his thumb across the photo, even pulled out a flashlight. "This doesn't look real," he announced, again loud enough for the line behind her. The photo was perfect, but truth wasn't the point. The point was doubt, suspicion, control. Minutes turned to an hour, then 2. Maya stood outside in the October chill. Her gown offered no warmth, her heels bit into her feet. Through the glass doors, she could see the glow of chandeliers, hear the muffled laughter of guests sipping champagne. And she, one of the wealthiest women in America, was treated like a trespasser. Every 20 minutes, Jake reappeared, still checking with management. But she had seen him inside, laughing with staff, making no calls. It wasn't a mistake. It was a message. Humiliation by delay. Humiliation by doubt. Sociologists call it gatekeeping. The quiet ways doors are held shut. The subtle reminders of, you don't belong here. History has no shortage of these doors. Jackie Robinson forced to change in separate locker rooms. Oprah Winfrey denied entry to luxury boutiques. Ordinary black families questioned in neighborhoods they had lived in for decades. Maya Johnson was living it again, in 2023, in the heart of Chicago. At one point, a woman in a mink coat brushed past her. She actually stepped to the side as though standing near Maya might somehow stain her. Another guest whispered to his companion, "Some people just don't know their place." The words carried like smoke, unavoidable, unforgivable. Finally, 2 hours later, Jake returned with her ID. "Guess it checks out," he muttered. And with no apology, no smile, he opened the rope. By then, Maya had missed the cocktail hour, the networking, the speeches. She stepped inside not as a celebrated guest, but as a tolerated outsider, and everyone in that room would sense it. Maya's heart ached, but her face stayed calm. She refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. Because dignity is not what they give you, it's what you protect inside yourself. Later that night, the Callahans and their guests would laugh, pour wine, push her to the floor. But the truth is, the seed of rage was planted here. On the sidewalk, in the cold, while the doors stayed closed. A spark, silent, growing hotter with every passing minute. And by the time Maya entered that ballroom, the spark had become a fire. What no one knew as they laughed and mocked was that Maya carried more than pain into that ballroom. She carried power, and the moment she revealed who she truly was, the Callahan's empire would begin to crumble. The laughter was still echoing when Maya touched the floor. Her gown, once radiant, was now dripping with red. Her palms stung, Her knees ached. Phones hovered above her like vultures circling prey, every screen capturing her humiliation, every chuckle cutting deeper. For a moment, the air was filled with only cruelty. But then, something shifted. Maya's hand pressed against the cold marble. She rose, slowly, deliberately, and as she stood, the room grew quieter. Not silent yet, but uneasy. There was something in her eyes, something that should have warned them all. She straightened her shoulders. She smoothed her ruined dress. And then she spoke. Her voice was calm. But calm can be more powerful than rage. "My name is Dr. Maya Johnson." The words cut through the chatter. Every phone wavered, every smirk faltered. "I am the founder and CEO of Johnson Global Holdings, a company valued at $60 billion, and the very company negotiating a $1.5 billion contract with the Callahan family." Silence. The kind of silence that weighs heavy, pressing down on every chest, making every breath feel dangerous. Edward Callahan's face drained of color. His glass slipped from his hand and shattered on the floor. Vivian froze, her lips parted, as if trying to form words that refused to come. Connor lowered his phone slowly, the cruel grin wiped from his face. Isabella's painted smile cracked. One sentence had undone them all. Around the room, guests shifted uncomfortably. Some gasped, some whispered, and others began deleting their videos in panic, because suddenly, this wasn't funny anymore. This was catastrophic. Maya continued, her voice steady, measured, sharp. "Yes, I own this building you are standing in tonight. I own the companies that employ your husbands, the banks that hold your mortgages, the firms that manage your retirement accounts. And while you laughed, while you mocked me, while you poured wine on me, I held in my hand the power to decide your future." It was not rage that terrified them, it was composure, a dignity so unshakable it became a weapon. Because here's the truth. Titles impress, money intimidates, but character commands. And in that moment, Maya Johnson's character eclipsed everything the Callahans pretended to be. Edward's mind raced. The numbers spun like a storm. $1.5 billion. The lifeline he had been praying for. The deal that would pay off debts, save the company, preserve the Callahan name. Gone. Destroyed by his own silence, by his family's cruelty. He wanted to speak, to apologize, to plead. But the words stuck in his throat. What excuse could erase what they had just done? Vivian trembled, fury and fear warring inside her. Her entire life built on status, shattered by a single revelation. The woman she had called Help was the very queen of the empire she so desperately needed to impress. Connor's stomach twisted. For the first time in his privileged life, his laughter turned to nausea. And Isabella, the cruelest of them all, realized the video she had orchestrated was no longer comedy. It was evidence of her arrogance, her downfall. Maya let the silence grow, let it weigh on them, because silence, in the right hands, can be louder than any scream. Then she delivered the final blow. Character is not built in boardrooms, it's revealed in moments like this, and tonight, you revealed yours. There it was. The truth laid bare. The Callahans had power, but they lacked character, and in the end, character outlasts wealth. Character outlasts titles. Character defines legacy. History remembers this lesson well. The Vanderbilts, once the richest family in America, squandered their fortune within a few generations, not because they lacked money, but because they lacked the discipline, the humility, the vision to sustain it. The Astors, once kings of New York society, eventually eclipsed by families who built, while they only consumed. Old money rots when pride replaces purpose, when arrogance replaces humility, when cruelty blinds those who think they will never fall. And that night, the Callahans joined the list. The ballroom, once buzzing with laughter, now sat in stunned silence. Every guest realized they had witnessed not just a humiliation, but the most expensive mistake in Chicago society, a $1.5 billion lesson in dignity. Maya turned her gaze across the room, her eyes steady, unflinching. I walked in here tonight as your equal. You chose to see me as less. Now, you will see me as more than you could ever afford. The words lingered, heavy, irrefutable, and with that, the balance of power shifted forever. But the revelation was only the beginning. Because the moment Maya made her call, the Callahan empire didn't just tremble, it collapsed. The ballroom was frozen. Maya's words still hung in the air like smoke after an explosion. Edward's glass lay shattered on the marble. Vivian's lips trembled. Connor's phone dangled useless in his hand. Isabella stared at her own reflection in the wine stain that spread across the floor. And then, Maya reached into her clutch, pulled out her phone, pressed one number. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. When the call connected, her voice was calm, cold, precise. James, cancel everything. The merger, the partnerships, the leases, all of it, effective immediately. A pause. Yes, every contract tied to Callahan Corp. Burn it to the ground. She ended the call. No hesitation, no second thoughts. The laughter was gone. The cruelty was gone. In its place, terror. The first to move were the lawyers. Within minutes, the double doors swung open. A team of attorneys in dark suits entered, briefcases in hand. They spread out across the room with the efficiency of surgeons. One woman stepped forward, silver hair, glasses, voice like steel. By order of Johnson Global Holdings, the following contracts are hereby terminated. She unfolded a stack of papers. The sound of crisp legal sheets echoed louder than music. The Callahan merger, valued at $1.5 billion. The technology partnerships, worth $400 million annually. The real estate leases covering your office towers. All charity sponsorships, all supply chain contracts, effective now. Each word fell like a hammer. With every line, Edward's face grew paler, his knees weaker. Guests gasped. Some clutched their pearls, others whispered frantically. And then the truth sank in. The Callahans weren't just embarrassed, they were finished. The ripple was immediate. One banker slipped quietly toward the door, texting his partners, "Pull out, they're toxic." A real estate developer followed, whispering, "If Johnson's out, we're out." Within minutes, the ballroom became a stampede. Guests abandoning the sinking ship, allies turning their backs, socialites pretending they'd never been there. It was the Titanic in designer gowns. This is the way power collapses. Not with a gunshot, not with an earthquake, but with silence, whispers, and doors quietly closing. It has happened before. In 2018, Starbucks faced global outrage when two black men were arrested for simply waiting at a Philadelphia cafe. Within hours, social media erupted. Within days, Starbucks closed 8,000 stores to retrain staff. Billions of dollars in market value shook on the stock exchange. Or take the Los Angeles Clippers. When owner Donald Sterling's racist remarks were leaked, players threatened to boycott. Sponsors fled. The NBA forced him to sell the team. Decades of power, gone in weeks. Reputation doesn't erode slowly anymore. It collapses instantly. One spark, one scandal, and the avalanche begins. And tonight, the Callahans triggered their own avalanche. Edward stumbled forward, his voice breaking. "Please, Dr. Johnson, we didn't know. If we had known your position, your importance..." Maya's eyes cut through him like glass. "You knew I was human. That should have been enough. The words struck harder than any legal notice. Because they weren't about money. They were about dignity, and everyone in that room understood it. Vivian's mask of arrogance cracked. Her hands shook as she clutched her champagne glass. But one night, one mistake, it doesn't justify destroying us. Maya tilted her head, voice calm. This wasn't a mistake. It was your character, and character has consequences. Connor muttered, desperate. This is reverse racism? You can't do this. The room turned on him instantly. Even his own parents stared in horror. Maya's reply was measured, merciless. This isn't reverse racism, Connor. This is accountability. Learn the difference. His face went red. His friends, once eager to laugh, backed away from him. No one wanted to be caught standing beside a sinking man. Isabella tried to speak, her voice trembling. I didn't mean, but Maya's lawyer cut her off. Intent does not erase impact. Every video recorded tonight proves exactly what was meant. Isabella fell silent. For once, words failed her. The exodus continued. Guests vanished through side doors. Socialites deleted photos from Instagram. Donors whispered about rethinking our association. It was the oldest story in society. When the tide turns, rats leave the ship, and the Callahans were left standing alone. In less than an hour, decades of reputation collapsed. Deals vanished. Allies disappeared. The Callahan name, once gilded in marble, was now toxic. It was a fall so complete, so public, that no one would ever forget it. Maya looked around the emptying room. Her dress still stained, her dignity intact. She spoke one final truth to the family that had mocked her. Power isn't in the titles you hold. It isn't in the wealth you inherit. It's in how you treat people when you think they have nothing. Tonight, you showed the world who you really are, and now the world will remember. The collapse was only the beginning, because the headlines that followed would turn the Callahan's humiliation into a cautionary tale for the entire world. The night ended in silence, but the world woke up to noise. Headlines blazed across every screen. Billionaire CEO cancels $1.5 billion deal after racist incident at gala. The most expensive act of arrogance in corporate history. Clips from the party. Connor laughing, Isabella's staged accident, Vivian's shrill insults circulated online within hours. The hashtags trended worldwide. Callahan collapse. Respect is priceless. The empire that had taken generations to build unraveled in days. Callahan Corp filed for bankruptcy within 6 months. The skyscrapers they once bragged about were auctioned off, one by one. Their penthouse on Michigan Avenue sold to a tech startup. Their summer home in the Hamptons, gone. Even their art collection, pieces they once flaunted as proof of refinement, was scattered into museums and private sales. It was more than financial ruin. It was erasure. The Callahan name, once engraved in marble, became a cautionary tale whispered in boardrooms. For Edward, the fall was the hardest. At 62, the man who had once signed billion-dollar deals now sat behind a small desk in a mid-tier real estate firm in Evanston. His salary barely covered rent. He commuted by train, carrying a briefcase that no longer impressed anyone. Each morning, he walked past skyscrapers he used to own. Now he entered them as a visitor, asking permission at the front desk. Co-workers whispered behind his back. Some pitied him, others mocked him. The patriarch of the Callahan dynasty reduced to middle management, a man living in the shadow of what he used to be. And late at night, when he stared into the mirror, he didn't see power anymore. He saw failure, the cost of silence. Vivian's punishment was different. Social exile, the queen of charity luncheons, the self-anointed empress of Chicago society, was uninvited from everything. Her name was quietly removed from country club rosters. Board members encouraged her resignation. Old friends crossed the street to avoid her. For years, she wielded social exclusion like a weapon. Now, she was on the other side. She lived in a modest home in the suburbs, surrounded not by chandeliers and gala gowns, but by silence. Sometimes she drove past the old haunts, the boutique hotels, the five-star restaurants. She pressed her face to the glass like a stranger. Inside, she could still hear the echo of her own laughter, mocking a woman who turned out to hold her entire fate. And she knew society had judged her character, not her closet. Connor fell fastest. At 29, the golden boy had nothing left. The videos of his drunken laughter became memes, shared with captions like, "Trust fund baby laughs his way into bankruptcy." Sponsors, friends, investors, everyone vanished. Without money, he was no longer interesting. He drifted between couches, then into seedy apartments. The champagne glasses were replaced with beer cans, the parties with strangers, and soon, the drugs. One arrest followed another. DUIs, possession, each mugshot worse than the last. For the first time, Connor realized what it felt like to be invisible. Not untouchable, not powerful, just forgotten. Isabella's fall was quieter, but just as brutal. The young woman who once commanded rooms with a smile now found every door locked. Her name, once whispered with admiration at social events, became poison in the business world. No firm would touch her. No investor would sit across from her. Potential partners Googled her name and found the video, her false kindness, her staged stumble, the wine blooming across Maya's gown. It replayed endlessly. Every time she tried to start over, it followed. Every time she smiled, people saw cruelty behind it. For the first time, Isabella understood that reputation, once lost, can never truly be reclaimed. The Callahans learned what so many before them had discovered. In America, power is not permanent. Think of Donald Sterling, the owner of the Los Angeles Clippers. One leaked recording of racist remarks, and decades of influence vanished. Players boycotted, sponsors fled, the NBA forced him out. Or think of Starbucks in 2018 when 2 black men were arrested for simply waiting in a cafe. Within hours, outrage spread across the globe. The company lost billions in market value, and for years, the brand has carried the scar. The Callahans believe their wealth insulated them, but wealth cannot protect against the truth. Once character is exposed, there is no shelter. By year's end, the dynasty was gone. Edward, a forgotten manager, Vivian, a ghost at charity events, Connor, adrift in addiction, Isabella, locked out of every deal, their empire, ashes, their legacy, shame. And every headline reminded the world why, because on one October night, they chose cruelty over decency, arrogance over humility, pride over humanity, and they paid the price. But for Maya Johnson, the story didn't end with their collapse, because while the Callahans fell, she rose even higher, transforming their downfall into a movement that would change lives far beyond the ballroom. The Callahans lost everything, but Maya. She gained something greater than money. She gained momentum. The morning after the gala, Maya walked into her office at Johnson Global Holdings. The headlines were everywhere. Her name, her face, the story of what had happened the night before. Reporters shouted questions. Cameras followed her every step. But she didn't flinch. She walked straight to her desk, placed her phone on speaker, and called her CFO. "Redirect the funds," she said. "All $1.5 billion. Move it into the Minority Startup Empowerment Fund. Effective immediately." There was silence on the other end. "Every penny, Dr. Johnson?" "Yes," she answered. "Every penny. If they thought humiliation would make me smaller, they were wrong. This is bigger than me now." Within hours, the press release went live. Johnson Global cancels Callahan deal. $1.5 billion redirected to support Black, Latino, Asian American, and Native-owned startups. The announcement set the internet on fire. Respect I's price list trended for the second day in a row. But now, another hashtag joined it. Maya Movement. Across Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, her story spread like wildfire. Clips of her standing tall in a wine-stained gown, quotes from her speech. "You knew I was human. That should have been enough." Character has consequences. They became rallying cries, printed on posters, painted on murals, shared in millions of captions. For young entrepreneurs of color, it was life-changing. A Latina founder in Los Angeles posted, "My startup was turned down 14 times. Banks told me I wasn't a good bet. But today, Dr. Maya Johnson gave me hope again." A young black engineer in Atlanta tweeted, "Watching her turn humiliation into power, that's the kind of role model we need." A native entrepreneur in Oklahoma posted a video. "This fund means I can finally build something for my community, not just survive." The comments piled up by the millions. The movement wasn't about one billionaire anymore. It was about every person who had ever been underestimated. Maya's choice tapped into something deeper, the new reality of power in the digital age. Once upon a time, power belonged to boardrooms, newspapers, gatekeepers. But now, it belongs to stories, to hashtags, to communities that amplify truth faster than any press release. In the old world, the Callahans might have buried the scandal, paid off the papers, silenced the witnesses. But in 2023, every guest at that gala had a phone. Every cruel laugh was captured. Every insult, every spill of wine lived forever online. And the more they tried to erase it, the more viral it became. That is the force of digital justice. The reason Starbucks had to close 8,000 stores in 2018 after 2 men were arrested for doing nothing more than waiting. The reason Donald Sterling lost the Los Angeles Clippers overnight when his words were leaked. When truth hits the internet, it doesn't crawl. It runs. It runs faster than lawyers, faster than spin doctors, faster than money. And that night, Maya's truth ran around the world. What began as humiliation became a symbol. What began as a broken dress became a banner. Her dignity turned into a movement. Inside Johnson Global, her team scrambled. Applications poured in by the thousands. Black founders pitching fintech apps. Latina scientists pitching biotech solutions. Native entrepreneurs designing sustainable housing. Each one fueled by the knowledge that someone finally believed in them. Maya reviewed the proposals late into the night. She read every story, every struggle, every dream. And she saw herself, the girl from Detroit, the one teachers had doubted, the one classmates had mocked, the one who refused to bend. Now she had the chance to lift others, to make sure no door stayed closed. In interviews, she was asked if she regretted canceling the deal. She answered simply, "How could I regret investing in humanity? That's the only investment that never fails." Her words lit up timelines, screenshotted, shared, chanted, because they weren't just about business. They were about justice, about rewriting who gets to belong. Sociologists began calling it the Maya effect, the moment when digital storytelling and financial power collided, when humiliation turned into empowerment, when a billionaire didn't hoard wealth, but redirected it to those shut out by the system. Business schools started case studies. Professors asked their students, "Is character now a corporate asset? Can dignity become more valuable than profit? And more importantly, what happens when a single act of cruelty awakens a movement?" For Maya, the answer was clear. She hadn't just walked out of the gala with her dignity. She walked out with an army of voices behind her. People who saw her not as a billionaire, but as proof that character could prevail. The Callahans lost their empire. But Maya built something far greater, a legacy. One not written in marble halls, but in hashtags, in startups funded, in lives changed, and for every young entrepreneur who once felt invisible, Maya's story was proof. They belonged, their voices mattered, and the world was finally ready to hear them. But with every movement comes resistance, and as Maya's influence grew, so did the backlash, from those who feared a world where dignity could outweigh old money power. Maya's stand became a symbol, but her story was not unique. It was part of a larger pattern, a script America has written over and over again. Take Oprah Winfrey. Paris. One of the most powerful women in media walked into Hermès, the luxury boutique. Worth billions. Recognized worldwide. And yet, the sales staff looked at her, then quietly told her the store was closed. It wasn't. Other customers continued to shop inside. Oprah later described the sting. "I know what racism feels like. I live with it every day. But this one hurt. Because it showed me that even with everything I've accomplished, to some people, I will never belong." Think about that. Oprah, arguably the most influential black woman on earth, still treated like she didn't deserve to touch a handbag. Wealth didn't erase prejudice. Fame didn't cancel suspicion. The script repeated, "You don't belong." Or look at Serena Williams. One of the greatest athletes of all time, a woman whose body had carried her to 23 Grand Slam titles. But when she gave birth in 2017, she nearly died. Serena felt shortness of breath, knew immediately she needed a CT scan for blood clots. She begged doctors to listen, but they dismissed her, told her she was just confused, that she was exaggerating her pain. Only after she insisted, again and again, did they check and find life-threatening blood clots in her lungs. Serena later said, "If I wasn't who I am, I probably wouldn't be here." Now imagine if Serena Williams, with her fame and resources, had to fight to be heard in a hospital. What happens to women without her platform? That's not just a failure of medicine. That's the deadly cost of bias. And then there's LeBron James, a global icon, a man who built schools for children, funded scholarships, and still dominates the NBA. In 2017, the gate of his Los Angeles home was spray-painted with a racial slur. Reporters asked him how it felt. His answer was simple, devastating. No matter how much money you have, no matter how famous you are, being black in America is tough, and we've got a long way to go. LeBron James, arguably one of the most celebrated athletes alive, still reduced to the color of his skin on the front gate of his house. Wealth didn't protect him. Fame didn't shield him. The script repeated, "You don't belong." Different places, different lives, but the same story. Oprah at Hermès, Serena in the hospital, LeBron in his own driveway, Maya in the ballroom. All of them sent the same message. Your achievements don't matter. Your humanity doesn't matter. To us, you will always be less. This is why Maya's decision struck so deeply. Because her humiliation wasn't just hers. It echoed Oprah's. It echoed Serena's. It echoed LeBron's. It echoed millions who may never see their names in headlines, but who live the same wounds every day. The quiet suspicion at the store, the dismissive tone at the hospital, the look at the office meeting that says, "You don't belong here." It is a script America keeps repeating. And yet, it's a script that can be rewritten. Maya's story proved that dignity can fight back, that one act of cruelty, exposed, can become a turning point. Oprah turned her exclusion into a global conversation about bias in luxury and fashion. Serena used her near-death experience to advocate for maternal health equity. LeBron transformed his pain into action, funding education and speaking truth on the biggest stages. And Maya turned her humiliation into a movement. Different names, different moments, but all fighting the same battle. To be seen as fully human. History shows us that progress rarely comes from comfort. It comes from confrontation. From these sharp, painful moments when the world reveals its bias, and someone refuses to stay silent. That is the thread connecting them all. Refusal, resilience, redemption. As one journalist wrote after the gala, what Maya Johnson did was more than cancel a deal. She canceled the illusion that wealth protects you from racism, and she showed us what happens when power finally answers cruelty with justice. Her story became proof of something LeBron once said. No matter how much money you have, being black in America is tough. But it also became proof of something else. That dignity, when defended, can ripple farther than money ever could. And that's why Maya's legacy didn't end with one night, because what she left behind was more than a broken dynasty. It was a lesson, one the world would carry forward. The Callahans thought they had power. They had the marble floors, the chandeliers, the last name that opened doors. But power built on arrogance is fragile. It crumbles at the first touch of truth. Maya showed us something different. That true power does not come from wealth. It comes from character. Think about it. Money can buy you a seat at the table, but only respect can keep you there. Titles fade. Fortunes vanish. But dignity endures. That was the real collapse of the Callahans. Not just the billions they lost, not just the empire that dissolved. It was the moment their character was exposed. The world saw who they truly were, and turned away. History repeats this lesson. The Vanderbilts lost their fortune within a century. Donald Sterling lost his team in a week. Brands like Starbucks lost billions overnight because of a single act of bias. Wealth cannot shield you from truth. Reputation cannot survive cruelty. In the end, character is the only currency that never devalues. Maya's story asks us to look inward, because this isn't just about one family, one gala, one billionaire. It's about us. How do we treat people when no one is watching? How do we respond when we see someone humiliated? Do we laugh with the crowd? Do we stay silent, or do we stand? Silence has a cost. Every guest who laughed that night, every phone that recorded without intervening, they became part of the collapse. And isn't that true in our own lives? When we see bullying in schools, when we see discrimination at work, when we see injustice in our neighborhoods, silence does not protect. Silence participates. Maya could have walked away. She could have hidden her humiliation. But she chose to stand, to reveal who she was, to redirect pain into purpose. And because she stood, others rose with her. Startups were funded. Dreams were reignited. Communities were lifted. All because one woman refused to bend. So here is the lesson. When you choose to belittle someone, you risk more than hurting their pride. You risk your own future, because you never know who they are. You never know what power they hold, and you never know when arrogance will cost you everything. But there is another side. When you choose respect, when you choose dignity, you plant seeds that grow beyond your imagination. A kind word at the right moment, a door held open, a voice raised when someone else is silenced. These choices echo. They ripple, they build legacies stronger than any fortune. As Maya herself said in her final interview after the gala, I didn't destroy the Callahans. They destroyed themselves. All I did was stop carrying their weight. That's the truth. Cruelty carries its own consequences. Respect carries its own rewards. So now, the question turns to you. Have you ever witnessed injustice? Have you ever seen someone mocked, excluded, disrespected? What did you do? Did you stay silent, or did you speak? Because silence is safe, but silence also surrenders power. The world doesn't change when we look away. It changes when we step in. Maya's story is dramatic. It's cinematic, but its core lesson is simple. Respect is not a luxury. It is a necessity, and the cost of forgetting that truth is everything. So I leave you with this question. The next time you see injustice, will you be part of the silence, or will you be the one who speaks? Because power isn't what you hold, it's how you use it, and respect is priceless. Cruelty feels cheap in the moment. A laugh at someone else's expense, a dismissive look, a careless word, but as we've seen, cruelty is the most expensive luxury in the world. It can cost you reputation, it can cost you opportunity, it can cost you everything. The Callahans thought arrogance was free, but the bill came due. And it was worth billions. Kindness, on the other hand, is the rarest luxury that costs nothing at all. A simple gesture, a moment of dignity, a choice to see another human being as equal. That choice has saved lives. That choice has changed history. And that choice is available to each of us every single day. So remember this. True power is not measured in money, not in titles, not in how high you stand above others. It's measured in how you lift others up, especially when they are at their lowest. Because when the lights fade, when the marble cracks, when fortunes vanish, all that remains is the way we treated each other. Maya's story is dramatic, it's cinematic, but the lesson is simple. Arrogance destroys, kindness builds, and respect is priceless. So the next time you face the choice to laugh or to stand silent or to speak up, remember this story. Ask yourself, will I spend cruelty or will I invest in kindness? Because cruelty may feel powerful in the moment, but kindness is the only luxury that grows richer the more you give it away. Thank you for staying with us through this journey. If this story moved you, if it made you think, share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget, like, subscribe, and join us here at Black Voice Matter for more stories that challenge, inspire, and remind us of what truly matters. Until next time, choose kindness. Because in the end, it is the greatest wealth any of us will ever hold.